Tony, just great to be with you and have this opportunity to look back over the last 40 years as we celebrate Church of the Nations family. And for those watching today, won't you just take us through something of the history of how it all began?
Yeah, Andy, it's great to be with you. And thanks for taking this journey and much of the 40 years with us as well. So it's great to chat. Yeah, but the 1960s were a very formative decade for Marilyn and I. It was our teenage years, of course, and I went through my personal cancer at that kind of time and got to grips with my first glimpses of the kingdom of heaven, etc., and got serious about our walk with God. And so we got married on the very first day of 1970, January 1. I've never forgotten my wedding anniversary, so that's a good thing. That decade that followed, we went straight into the ministry training to our denomination that we're in. And just a few weeks after we got married, and then that next decade, everything that began to form together for what we now live in. During that time, we moved to the United Kingdom to live. And in 75, 76 there, 75 we moved, 76, 77, we did an outreach down in a little Welsh town called Milford Haven. Mara and I took a team down there out of a mission base that we were with, a youth of the mission base at that point, to do a 2-week outreach, and ended up being there the best part of 2 years, out of which a church eventually came and is still in existence today and is still a part of our CotN family. So that was technically the first seed. But out of there in 1978, we went with a team down to Argentina for the World Cup of soccer, or the World Cup of football, and the year Argentina won. And so it was a bit hectic down there, but in the midst of a prayer time down there on the ground with some intercessors praying for Argentina, I just felt God began to release to me that it was time, that the original reason we went to England to get involved in church planning, etc., it was time for that to move. And we had this vision outlined to me that was about centers being built, hubs, arms going out, starting to reach out to various areas and even out to the nations, although that really only grew a little bit later on. So back in 78, we went back to the UK. 79, we started work there off the base where we were living, and that became technically the first official seed of what became Church of the Nations as we began to grow out into the 80s then, and into South Africa, which we just celebrated 40 years there as well. That all started back in 1982. So from that 76 to 82, it was all born, and here we are 40 years later now.
So you've mentioned some of the birthday celebrations, but just take us back on how Church of the Nations has evolved as a family over the last 40 years, Tony.
Yeah, it seems every decade we go into a new stage, and I think that was, for someone, the way my mind works. God was gracious and enabled us to walk that way. Getting married, of course, right at the beginning of the 70s, then 79, 80, Church of the Nations starting. And then back in 1979 then, we started. In 1989, we had a conference down in a place called Bognor Regis in the UK. And it was there, in preparation for that and prayer times before that, we felt the okay from God to come under one name called Church of the Nations. Before that, it was called different things around the world. And we felt He said to us, it's good to have a name to identify the family, but not for that to be the controlling factor, just to identify us as a family, but not to put walls around us or anything like that. So that started back in 89. Then in 1999, we were in a prayer time in Westminster Central Hall in London, and we were meeting as a team there along with some people from another team. And over 3 or 4 days of just seeking God, we felt Him saying to us that He wanted us to build something that could go globally, but at the same time would not end up with a pyramid top or just a Protestant Pope, we might say, or something at the top. In other words, it wouldn't end with me, it'd be a flat top. So we were asking how that could happen. And in those days, another apostolic network in the UK, their leader reminded us by saying all the pyramids were in Egypt, none were in Israel. So we didn't want to have a pyramid that ended up just with a pope at the top in that sense. So we began to pray about that and felt God showed us out of the scriptures that he wanted us to build from a Hebrew model, not methodology and that kind of thing, but from a Hebrew model of concept of building family, clan, tribe, and nation. A family being a local expression, a local church, or a local community of believers, whatever that expression might take. And a clan being, we call it a cluster rather than the word clan, but a cluster then of those families that would then become an apostolic family like that. And then the family, clan, and tribe, the tribe being Church of the Nations, the nation being the kingdom of heaven at large, and Church of the Nations just one small tribe that make up the whole nation. In the midst of that, we felt God laid on our hearts, always reason from the whole to the part, and then work it out from the parts of the whole. So our heart was always from day one to see the big picture of what was going on globally in his kingdom, and then work it out from where we were. So that's how we progressed through 1999. 2009, we were meeting as a leadership team before a conference again down in Plymouth in the UK. And in that time, we felt it was time to identify fully to move to a family of apostolic clusters and really identify ourselves as that, and therefore shift the governance into the cluster life and not just in one central controlling cluster. Before that, our slogan in Church of the Nations was building a family of churches reaching the nations. And so there we moved the slogan to say a family of apostolic clusters advancing the kingdom of God. And then each of those clusters, we trust, fulfilling the original definition of being a family of those communities of believers and affecting the nations from there. And that took us right through to 2019, where then each cluster more was going to be responsible for what the next decade was going to hold for them. And for us in the Macarius cluster, stroke connected cluster now that we've called, we embrace the philosophy of reasoning the church from the kingdom rather than the kingdom from the church. And that was only sounds like a very small thing, but it was quite a major shift, because we realized one of the things that were happening, churches were evolving and then asking the question, where does the kingdom fit into all this? Where we realized the mission we've been built on right back from the day one was a kingdom mandate to go and preach the gospel of the kingdom. And we saw that was really the apostolic call out of the Antioch church, and that they were sent to establish the kingdom, out of which, as they did, communities of believers or churches, whatever we would refer to them, were raised up as a whole ecclesia. The global church was being established, local expressions of that would be established, and that would become the place that life would operate out of. So we moved to that place. That was 2019. And so I guess there's another one coming in a few years' time.
And as you look forward to that, Tony, what do you see for Church of the Nations as a family, and particularly how do you see church within that context?
Yeah, it's a great question, because the kingdom of heaven and the church, although totally involved with each other, intertwined, they're not exactly the same. The kingdom is a much wider expression of what God's doing on earth. And the church, I believe, is the driving engine of that, the engine room of that. When Jesus said to his disciples, I will build my ecclesia and the gates of hell will not prevail against it, he was talking about his government, his kingdom government that would govern the kingdom of heaven. And that ecclesia, now that's expressed in all kinds of different ways in different localities and different nations in different ways. But it's very vital, because that's the place where the community of believers operate. And out of the community of believers operating there, that's where they live in safety, they live secure, they live strengthening one another, all the one another's we teach about out of the Bible, and where people are trained and equipped to go and fulfill their kingdom destiny that may not be operating just out of so-called church life, but out in all the spheres of society that we hear about today, from the marketplace to education to governments to all kinds of things. And so that had been our journey, because all through the years that became more defined, and I see will even be more defined as we go forward. So that community of believers, as we call the church, is very vital. It's mission organizations will say, and history proves out, that the greatest way to evangelize is the replanting of communities, either small communities out of homes, or we sometimes talk about it being like rabbits multiply much quicker than elephants do, and they multiply quickly. But it is said and stated with some other people I know in this kind of life have studied it very closely, that in the first year or two of a church being planted, something up to 80% of the people are new converts. After 10 years, that comes down to about 5 or 10%. So obviously the greatest way to evangelize is the multiplication of kingdom-shaped communities that we call the church or whatever. So that's a very vital part of expanding the kingdom. The kingdom grows two ways to me, and it grows through influence into all parts of society and grows numerically by people being born again and added into the kingdom population, obviously. That is very vital, and to have one without the other is just not worth it.
There's so much more that we could talk about, Tony, but I do want to ask you a final question, which I know you've been asked before, and that is, when you look at the Church of the Nations now, is it what you originally envisaged way back in Argentina in 1978?
Yeah, it's a great question. When I get asked that one, my response often is, I hope not, because, when things are first shared, it's often a little limited and you grow in understanding of it. I think one of the areas that we've grown in, though, is understanding cause, community, and cooperation, which cause being the kingdom vision, community being the families of God's people, like I've explained already, and cooperation being enough governance around it to be able to keep moving forward. The skeleton, like in a human body, you don't see the skeleton, but it's there if the human body is healthy. And but what we saw back there, I would say, as God's added people to us, as we've grown, as we've developed, as we've increased our understanding of church and the kingdom, all those aspects, it's got much broader and much wider. But right in the very center of it, I can still see that seed, and that really is a definition of what kingdom life is all about. I still see that seed that is in the very essence of it, those hubs serving out into wider areas, serving out into the community, serving out in the nation, serving out into the globe. So the very seed is still there, but now it's grown to be a tree or a mustard tree. It's much bigger. And I think, they are the very exciting things of it. I think the thing that will hold us together and increasing our capacity as we go is our unity in values and ability to celebrate diversity. I think we've embraced that through the time. And I believe that was a seed that God was putting in us even in those very early days, but has grown much more now as we spread across the nations. And I believe as we go through this, the seed is still there, is now expanded, it's grown, thankful to all those other apostolic, prophetic, and other fivefold giftings and all kinds of intercessors and people that God's added to us over the years, and also our cultural shifts, just to understand things in much wider ways. I think that seed will be protected in there, but a generation is going to be released now that carries those things and that very seed, to see it develop in the way that's very close to their heart and see it reach in the age in which they live, which we refer to somewhat maybe like a post-pandemic age now or a post-COVID age, but where everything's shifted. The world has shifted, the church has shifted, kingdom emphases haven't shifted because that's still the same. But someone said to Maren and I, and in the very early days of the journey, an evangelist, as we're just beginning to have children, said, never say to your daughters, and we're heading up with 3, but never say to your children or your daughters, when I was your age. And through God's grace, I don't think I ever have said that to them, because I realized, and he explained to me, you never were their age. You were their years, but not their age. And so my heart is from that seed that we saw way back then, and now grown out to affecting out into maybe 50 nations around the world, directly into another 50. Then I see that there's a generation now having to lay hold of those foundations and see them work in their age, an age in which I know little about really, but they live in and are going to release this kingdom life into that age. So I'm excited for that and thrilled to be a part of those who are helping to father that.
Tony, thank you so much for what you've done in allowing the Lord to use you to be part of this. And may we celebrate many, many more years of the family that is Church of the Nations. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andy. Bye.